Hello, and welcome to the 5th Oxford Archaeology Research Seminar, entitled Identity, Kinship and Community, Early Medieval Death and Burial across southeastern and northwestern England. The seminar will focus on early medieval cemeteries, drawing on evidence from Oxford Archaeology's excavations in Cambridgeshire, Suffolk and Cumbria, and spanning the late 5th to the 11th centuries AD. We will put forward some new questions relating to such issues as community, ethnicity, burial expression, chronology, and transition. Firstly, Stuart Ladd from our Cambridge office will talk about the early Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Hatherdene Close on the outskirts of modern Cambridge. The site's origins lie in a Roman cemetery featuring 7 cremation burials and a decapitated inhumation burial in a series of enclosures and small square barrows. Use of the site changed in the 5th century, with typical Anglo-Saxon burial practices seeing intensive use of the space from the later 5th into the 7th century. Some 130 individuals were recovered from 100 graves, clustered around the remnant Roman earthworks. The cemetery is unusual for its multiple burials, with individuals and sometimes buried in double, triple, or quadruple graves, and with stacked graves reopened and reused. A substantial minority also exhibited evidence of disturbance and destruction for other purposes. These practices provide a glimpse of local identity and the community's ongoing relationship with the cemetery and its origins. Toby Martin of the University of Oxford will then explore 2 interpretative strands in the light of OA's excavations of 3 5th to 7th century cemeteries in eastern England, that at Hatherdene, along with the cemeteries at northwest Ely and Eye Airfield. The first strand he explores will examine the significance of landscapes, and particularly movement through landscapes, when it came to choosing appropriate sites for burial. The second strand explores how the gradual accumulation of burials in a cemetery created and manipulated connections between the living and deceased populations. Both strands, considered together, reveal something of how a sense of community and belonging were built over time in early medieval communities. Adam Parsons from our Lancaster office will then talk about 3 sites excavated in northwest England: Dacre, Workington and Cumwhitton. These sites help to illustrate the development of early medieval Cumbria from the 7th to the 11th centuries, from a relatively stable part of the Kingdom of Northumbria, with churchyard burials in a small number of high-status ecclesiastical sites, through a period in the 9th and 10th centuries where Scandinavian immigrants to the region buried their dead with their own traditions within fully furnished burials containing weapons, jewellery and other grave goods. This was followed in the 11th century by evidence from Workington of the complete reorganisation of the site, a much larger quantity of sculpture found, suggesting a movement towards the focus of a new community centred around a parish church. I'm delighted to say that our 3 speakers will then be joined to discuss the sites and the questions they raise by Professor Helena Hamerow of the University of Oxford, who will chair the discussion panel, Dr. Sam Lucy of the University of Cambridge, Professor Claire Downham of the University of Liverpool, Professor Duncan Sayer of the University of Central Lancashire, and Rachel Newman of Oxford Archaeology North. They'll be discussing the issues raised by the 3 talks in more detail, so please do send in your questions during the seminar via the Q&A function, and they will do their best to answer them. But first, I'll hand you over to Stuart Ladd, who will talk about the Anglo-Saxon Cemetery at Hatherdene Close, Cherry Hinton. Stuart.
I'm going to take you through the origins, development and structure of the Anglo-Saxon Cemetery at Hatherdene Close, as well as some aspects of how it was used during the 5th to 7th century. Although the Anglo-Saxon phase is obviously the focus of this seminar, I will also outline the Iron Age landscape and Roman cemetery, as these appear to have been fundamental to the establishment of the later cemetery. The site lies in modern-day Cherry Hinton, around 4 kilometres east of the Roman fort at Cambridge. Hatherdene Close is on the north side of Coldham's Lane, a road which follows a natural ridgeway from the southeast, forming a parallel of the Roman route known as Wart's Causeway. Our excavations suggest that the Coldham's Lane route was probably in use in the Roman period, representing another southeasterly link to Cambridge. The site of a Roman villa excavated in the 1980s lies approximately 2 kilometres to the east. Hatherdene Close was evaluated by trial trenching in 2007, with full excavation finally undertaken in 2016. The CAU are currently undertaking new excavations on two sides of the site, helping to complete the picture. The site overlooks lower lying ground adjacent to Cambridge Airport that drains to the north. At the northern end of the site, downhill from the Coldham's Lane Ridge, we found the remains of a possible former spring. And in the late Iron Age, this location was enclosed, first by a series of pits, possibly containing trees, and then by a series of ditches. This is highlighted in yellow, and the new excavations show that this formed a complete sub-square enclosure 70 to 80 metres across. The location appears to have already been significant by the late Iron Age. The use of pits, potentially indicating the presence of trees, which may have been torn down later, to form a porous enclosure is unusual. It is tempting to see this as a nematon or shrine, incorporating natural materials surrounding a possible spring. And by the 2nd century AD, a well had been cut into the spring deposits and a trackway established, linking it to Coldham's Lane. A wider series of enclosures have also been exposed to the north. At around the same time, the first phase of the Roman cemetery was established, with a ditched enclosure surrounding a possible founding cremation burial of some status. This featured an urn of local Horningsea ware, as well as 3 fine flagons and 3 Samian platters. The enclosure was then extended as additional cremation burials were added, with one placed in a small square barrow to the northwest. The whole complex was linked to the well and the spring by the trackway. In all, there were 7 undisturbed cremations and 1 decapitated inhumation burial spanning a period of perhaps 3 centuries of use. From this we can imagine that burial at this cemetery occurred on an interval of decades and was reserved for an exclusive elite, perhaps linked to the villa situated to the east, which appears to have remained in use into the 5th century AD. I'd also like to draw attention to this later possible grave, enclosed in an even larger sub-square barrow or enclosure ditch. It overlapped the earlier barrow and enclosures. This contained a few disturbed fragments of fine Roman vessels, typical of the other Roman cremation burials, as well as a jet hairpin. Together, these hints of a disturbed cremation burial were a small number of articulated, uncremated human bones distributed throughout its fill, and I'll return to these later. By the middle of the 5th century AD, burial proliferated at the site with the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon phase of the cemetery. These burials were far more numerous, with 100 graves containing around 130 individuals, with burial in this manner continuing into the 7th century AD. They were focused on the Roman cemetery enclosures and largely respected the line of the Roman trackway. The cemetery extended under Hatherdene Close and may also have continued towards Coldham's Lane, although there was an uncertain degree of modern truncation here. To the northeast, the cemetery was bounded by a timber structure, which I will return to shortly. Most graves were arranged in loose rows to the northeast of the Roman complex, and these graves rarely intersected, implying that they were clearly marked above ground. 2 graves were surrounded by ring ditches forming small circular barrows. However, the 2 later Roman square barrows or enclosures appear to be a particular focus, with several densely concentrated, multiple graves concentrated between them. Although burials did not encroach into the bounds of their ditches, 2 were cut within the larger sub-square ditch after it had silted up. It's not clear whether the internal spaces of these enclosures were avoided for burial, or if burials in an upcast mound were then lost to truncation. In contrast, numerous graves transgressed the earlier Roman cremation enclosures on the southeast part of the site, although the majority of graves lay to the northeast. Many of the individuals were buried with grave good assemblages typical of the period, although 45 were unfurnished. 2 barrow burials were identified, with small ring ditches surrounding the graves on the northwest side of the cemetery. Additional barrow ditches may have been present, but have since been truncated, for instance around grave 273. The example pictured here contained limestone and tufa in its fill. These stones would have slumped in from the central mound, and most of the stone was irregular rubble, but a small number of faced pieces show that they derived from a building, most likely of Roman date. This stone-capped mound would have been a striking addition to the cemetery, positioned immediately adjacent to the Roman trackway and clearly visible from the Coldham's Lane ridgeway to the south. The timber structure on the northeast side of the cemetery consisted of 68 post holes, many of which can be arranged into two aligned structures. None of these produce direct dating evidence, however, burials respecting its line belong to the earliest phases, so it was possibly in place by the later 5th century, if not from the start of this phase of the cemetery's use. It probably remained into the 7th century, as the cemetery never expanded over this area. The building lacks corner posts, and the northwest structure has inset entrances, which are rare but seen elsewhere, such as Mucking. Less clear insets may also have been present in the southeast part of the structure. As far as we are aware, other buildings are known from other cemeteries of this period, but totally unprecedented in this specific arrangement. The most common grave goods were typical of the period, including jewellery and weaponry, both of which have helped to narrow down the chronological range for the cemetery. In addition to these finds, some were buried with whole pots or large fragments of pottery, knives, toiletry items, keys and girdle hangers, purses, a bone comb, and also one glass claw beaker. This is one of the more intriguing finds. It's a zoomorphic gilded copper alloy object. Although we have previously been using the term hippogriff, its stylistic elements are ambiguous. It could be seen as a single quadruped with a hooked beak, or equally as a larger quadruped devouring another. Its style 2 elements suggest a date in the first 2/3 of the 6th century. It may originally have been a shield mount, for which there are other parallels, or at least a brooch designed to resemble one, but the lugs added to its reverse side show that it had certainly served as a brooch. It was found here with an adolescent burial, upturned below their chin. It was accompanied by a modest array of glass beads, a fish-shaped pendant which may also have been a shield mount, a third definite shield mount, as well as 2 Roman coins, one of which was perforated to form another pendant. Because of the density of burials and the presence of stratigraphic relationships for almost 50% of the individuals, it has been possible to assign a subphase to around 74 of the graves. Although it was only possible to broadly assign weaponry to one phase up to the mid-6th century, jewellery assemblages could be shown to belong to 3 subphases between the mid-5th and later 7th century. Absent grave goods, other factors point to earlier burials. The majority of graves were aligned southwest to northeast, with individuals buried in a supine position with their head to the southwest. However, 2 examples were at 90 degrees to this, and in both cases, despite a lack of grave goods, they were clearly stratigraphically earlier. This example, SK361, was partly truncated by a sequence of later burials. This alignment was distinct earlier, and it more closely matched the Roman cemetery's principal alignment and that of the large possible Roman cremation pit. The radiocarbon date returned by this individual ranged from the end of the 4th century to the mid-6th century. These broad ranges are due to a plateau in the radiocarbon calibration curve across this period. However, the radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, and finds chronology all combine to suggest an early post-Roman date for this phase of the cemetery. Certainly, the transition to this phase was probably within decades of the final Roman cremation burial. At the other end of the scale, 2 complex graves located in the centre of the cemetery hinted at later changes in burial tradition. In both cases, the earlier inhumations followed the traditional southwest to northeast alignment. However, the final burial in each case was in a flexed or crouched position with their head to the north and facing west. Radiocarbon dates place both these distinctive stratigraphically later burials in the later 6th century. We've already seen several examples of multiple burials, and that's because these are one of the most distinctive aspects of this cemetery. These occur elsewhere, but in unusually high numbers at Hatherdene Close. We have examples of both contemporary double or triple burials, as well as sequential or stacked burials of up to 4 individuals in the same grave. The groups pictured left and centre were clearly interred at the same time. In the example on the right, SK224 was buried after SK225. Radiocarbon dates suggest the difference in time could have been decades, and yet minimal disturbance was done to the earlier skeletons beneath. We have further examples of reuse of graves. On the left, these 2 individuals were clearly buried in almost the same flexed position, right neck against each other. The right hip and femur of the earlier individual were damaged on burial of the later individual, and these bones were discovered higher up in the grave fill. So clearly some time had elapsed between burials, but the positioning of the earlier individual was considered important enough to replicate with some care in the later burial. In contrast, although rare, some graves were reopened and their earlier occupants heavily damaged or disregarded. Both of these cases, centre and right, saw the earlier individual almost completely truncated and disturbed. We also have a rare case here of a prone burial on the right. This does raise the question of how many times graves were reused and how many individuals were entirely removed and discarded. Disarticulated bone in grave backfills was rare, so this information is archaeologically completely invisible. Other graves were visibly disturbed, but clearly not for the purposes of additional burials. On the left, we have an example where the left shoulder was disturbed as well as the left femur. These are typically locations of brooches and girdle hangers, so perhaps specific grave goods were being targeted for theft. The partial articulation of the shoulder joint also shows that this was done when the body had only partially decayed, but not immediately following burial. In the example on the right, only the top of the skull was disturbed, with the jaw left in place, while the skull was inverted and rotated. Unusually, a brooch was found by the right hip, but no other bones were disturbed. This displacement may suggest the individual was contained in a coffin space, although no timber residues survived. Contemporary grave disturbance of these kinds is well documented for the period in southeast England and the continent. It serves to show that the community had few qualms about reopening graves, whether for respectful, utilitarian or more nefarious purposes, and demonstrates that the cemetery had an active, continuous role in the life of the community. Finally, I want to return to this possible Roman feature. As mentioned before, it contained a number of fragments of uncremated human bone, in addition to pieces of fine Roman pottery only seen elsewhere on the site in cremation burials. Iron fittings found along one side and possible post holes at the southeast end point to an elaborate structure or possible coffin. The bone fragments belong to at least 2 individuals, and one of which returned a radiocarbon date in the later 6th or 7th century. That is among the latest well-dated burials from this cemetery. Whether or not this was originally a Roman feature, it appeared to be an important focus for later burials, although none were placed within the bounds of its enclosing ditch. You could perhaps imagine it being seen as a founder or ancestor burial. However, the dated human remains within the pit belong to the latter part of the cemetery's use. So whatever status those 2 or more individuals held to justify their inclusion in this auspicious, reserved location, they were later subjected to some of the most thorough disturbance of any grave on the site. Of course, alternatively, the bones may represent charnel, incorporated by chance during an attempt to interfere with this possible grave. This scenario still points to the significance the feature held during the latter part of the cemetery's use. Whatever happened here, this is perhaps the most clear demonstration that when people were buried here, they weren't simply memorialized or just forgotten, but were repeatedly revisited, added to, removed, destroyed, and contested by the living community. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Toby Martin, and in this presentation I'm going to be synthesising some findings from the 3 5th to 7th century cemeteries excavated by Oxford Archaeology in recent years. Watching these sites as they were excavated in close communication with the excavation teams, one common theme that emerged quite clearly to me was how we could interpret burial as a means of creating senses of belonging attached to quite specific funerary landscapes. In other words, for these scattered agricultural populations, cemeteries and the way in which they manipulated and changed the landscape was one means by which they created a sense of community. First of all, I'd like to introduce the three sites. You've heard a lot about Hatherdene Close already from Stuart Ladd, so I won't say more about that now, but in short, we had about 130 inhumations belonging to the 5th to 7th centuries, excavated in 2016. We've pretty much completed work on that site, actually, with the monograph on the near horizon, we hope. A year later, as part of a much larger excavation to the northwest of Ely, this site here on the right, a further 28 inhumations came to light. We've completed enough of the post-excavation analysis to know that the site also occupies the 5th to 7th centuries, but we're still very much at a preliminary stage of analysis. And the third site is this one here in the middle, Eye Airfield in Suffolk, with excavations only finishing a few weeks ago. Again, roughly 100 inhumations, but we're at an even earlier stage of analysis with this site. I've seen just about enough to be able to say tentatively that the site belongs to the 5th to 7th centuries as well. We might predict some changes to that interim statement. So we have these three sites, two large and one bit smaller, all of the same chronological range, and all from this relatively defined area in southeast England. During the 5th to 7th centuries, people didn't live in towns, but they lived in farming communities in which a small number of households were grouped together in what we would call a rural settlement. We don't know much for certain about the composition of these households, and what we do know tends to be extrapolated from later law codes or from the cemeteries associated with these settlements themselves. But we're fairly certain that each household contained a more complex collective than what we would call a nuclear family. Even more intriguing to me is the sense of shared identity that would have existed between these households in any one rural settlement, surely much smaller than what we would usually call a tribal unit, and defined at least to some extent not only by their shared living space, but by the cemeteries that they buried their dead in. So at Mucking, for instance, while the cemetery itself has this relatively temporary feel as it crawls across the landscape over the duration of 3 centuries, it's two cemeteries in the middle, one here and a little bit of one excavated to its west. The cemeteries remain stable. When I use the word community in this presentation, I'm referring to several things. Foremost, a sense of shared belonging by all those using any one cemetery, but also the internal texture of that community, comprising the links created within and beyond households using burial rituals, friendships, kinships, perhaps even enmities. So how might we apply this kind of thinking to the cemeteries in question? Well, take for instance the spear burials with spears from Hatherdene Close. There's been much work on what weapon burial might mean in this period, and we tend to now think of it as a marker of social status, as a warrior identity, rather than being an accurate reflection of the proportion of any one community that actually engaged regularly in warfare. Weapon burial was restricted to men, for the most part anyway, usually commencing with adolescence. The same is true at Hatherdene, where all these burials were over the age of 13. Weapon burial at Hatherdene Close was really homogeneous. In nearly all cases it included just one spear and a buckle and a knife at the waist, and in 4 cases also a shield. In 10 of those cases, the spear was on the left-hand side of the body, up by the side of the head, with the spear shaft running down the left-hand side of the grave. But in 4 cases, the spear was on the right, and in only 2 of those was there actually a mirror of the situation, with the most of them. 2 deviated much more dramatically. The first one was skeleton 1164, who appeared to have their spear dismantled in the grave, because the ferrule, which you can just about see here lying just behind the blade, which usually sits at the spear butt, the base of the spear, had been taken off and placed next to the spearhead. So presumably the shaft had been snapped, taken in two, or the whole thing had been deconstructed. The second was skeleton 640, who again had the spear on the right-hand side of the body, but lying down by the waist. And again, there isn't really room for a full-length spear inside this grave, so again, we might hypothesize that the spear was once again taken apart before it was interred in this grave. Now, there's no national pattern for the side of the body on which a spear is buried. So this obvious preference for the left at Hatherdene Close is part of a local tradition. Burials that deviated from it, and this is what really makes the case, I think, deviated quite dramatically, including the fragmentation of the weapon itself. So these burials are saying something slightly different from all those others. At Hatherdene Close, there was also a preference for shields to be laid nearer to the top of the grave, often actually leaning against one of the walls. And that also goes against the national pattern for shields lying in the middle of the grave, lying on the middle of the body, rather, as in this example here with skeleton 640. So this one isn't just deviating from the local norm by having the spear at the waist and possibly deconstructed, it's also deviating from the local norm by having the shield right on the centre of the body. It suggests again that these burials are being marked out as exceptional. Deviation aside, what the general consistency of weapon burial right at Hatherdene Close, which is the important point really, tells us that local memory was strong and that these traditions mattered. These burials all fall into Hines and Bayliss' phases ASMO and ASMP, which puts most of them in a period of about 75 years, possibly a bit more, between the later 5th century and the mid-6th century. So they're all likely to have been within 2 or 3, perhaps 4 at a stretch, generations of each other, and many of them would have been contemporaries. They would have known each other. What we therefore see in these burials is how material culture and the funeral ritual itself is binding this group tighter still through a memorializing tradition. Burial with jewellery in this period also largely began in adolescence and was largely limited to women. Unlike those homogeneous weapon burials, however, burials with jewellery are remarkable for showing almost limitless diversity, so it's much harder to draw out any convincing groups within this interred cohort with jewellery. But about 25 individuals at Hatherdene Close wore brooches in various combinations, and we were able to separate them out into 3 different subphases. Brooches in this region of England tend to be worn for 2 main purposes, either fastening a cloak centrally on the chest, as in these 2 reconstructions here, or they're used on the shoulders to fasten a gown, an inner gown, or a peplos dress. Now, these shoulder brooches usually match as a pair, like in this example here from associated with skeleton 493. But what we found is that those matching brooches tend to be part of the earlier subphase of jewellery burial, from roughly the mid-5th century up just about into the early 6th century, whereas the non-matching brooches tended to be later, in the next phase, which runs from the early 6th century through to the mid-6th century. The crucial fact here is that without the rest of those assemblages, we wouldn't have been able to distinguish chronologically between them. So these brooches, typologically speaking, these small shoulder brooches, are chronologically indistinguishable. So those later non-matching pairs could well have been quite old by their time of interment. So could it be that those non-matching pairs were more common in the slightly later period because they'd been inherited, broken and lost down the generations? If so, could we be witnessing a slightly different process by which this community was drawing those intergenerational links, these intergenerational connections, through the inheritance of jewellery from a forebear, by a forebear in the present, but also through the interment of those assemblages at a later date, echoing those burials of their forebears from the previous generation or two. Onto a slightly different subject now. The cemetery at Hatherdene Close sits on one side of a slight ridge overlooking the flat basin of the Cam over here to the north, which is now Cambridge Airport. It's probably just off a routeway which runs down here to the north-east towards the small Roman defended town, Durilla Ponte. You see the relationship on this map. The star is Hatherdene Close. This is the defended town. Now, whatever Durilla Ponte was in the earlier 5th century when this new phase of burial commenced at Hatherdene Close was different to whatever it might have been in the 7th century, whatever ruins remained in Durilla Ponte by then when burial at Hatherdene Close ceased. So we cannot take that relationship as a single fact, but nevertheless, what we see here is a clear sighting of a cemetery along a routeway that heads towards that town. It's that routeway that's really important. And if you remember Stuart Ladd's presentation, there was another trackway that comes a spur off this main routeway that goes along this ridge that leads down towards the Iron Age spring complex. So the cemetery is at this slight little crossroads, an important routeway on the way into Roman Cambridge. At this stage, we'll turn to one of our other sites. This is the site at Eye Airfield in Suffolk. Now, in 2007-2011, Suffolk County Council Archaeological Services excavated to the south of where we've just finished excavations up here. You'll forgive my site superimposition of these plans together. It's not wholly accurate, but it's broadly the picture that you need to see. What they uncovered was an early medieval settlement belonging to the 5th to 7th century down here, overlying the remains of a late Roman field system. The early medieval settlement included a couple of post-hole buildings and 18 sunken featured buildings, and it's almost certainly contemporary with our cemetery up here, showing a little bit more detail on the left there. You will note that a trackway actually links the settlement to the cemetery, though its dating is problematic. So in the 2022 excavations, the north-south stretch has been dated to the Iron Age with a very, very small amount of pottery, while the east-west spur up here has been dated to the Roman period, but again with a very small amount of pottery. In these excavations down here, the excavators said that typologically speaking, the trackway could be Middle Saxon, but actually stratigraphically, it seems to be late Roman. But that's the dating of the trackway is going to be a really big question for us in post-excavation analysis. Either way, the late Roman field system does seem to respect the trackway, and surely the siting of our cemetery next to this trackway suggests that it was extant in the early medieval period as well. It may well be a routeway that existed for a very, very long time. So although we're currently quite cautious in our interpretation, once again, the location of the cemetery could be significant for being on the way from one settlement to somewhere else, but quite where that was, we don't really know. The situation of the cemetery at northwest Ely is the most striking of all. The cemetery is associated with this ditched trackway with recut ditches that aligns almost perfectly with the northerly extension of Akerman Street as it leaves Ely and continues off into the fens. Secondly, the early medieval cemeteries, I should say, there's one up here and one just down here, are not just associated with the road, they're actually interred in the space of the road, which is a pretty unique situation for this period, and something, again, for us to really puzzle over when it comes to post-excavation analysis. The second thing, actually, is that these burials in the road are, quite strictly speaking, a 5th and 6th century phenomenon. In the 7th century, or in the later 6th century perhaps, burial switches into this southern cemetery, and we know that not just from the grave goods from these cemeteries. So this little silver and garnet pin, very distinctive of the 7th century, came from the southern cemetery, whereas these brooches, much more typical of the late 5th and 6th, came from the northern cemetery. We've also confirmed that with radiocarbon dating now. So all three of our sites have this compelling evidence for the association of burial, not necessarily directly with places of habitation, but with roots across a landscape. This tells us something important about the significance of these cemeteries in those landscapes, being marked out specifically for travellers, including the daily comings and goings between field, pasture and settlement, but also perhaps for more infrequent visitors from further afield, for whom these burials, these cemeteries, marked a form of territorial signature that we can imagine would have been very well understood at the time. Now, there's so much more that we could say about these sites, but I've limited my presentation to a quite specific theme, I hope, which is how rural communities of the 5th to 7th centuries used their cemeteries to sculpt a sense of belonging that was cumulative, dynamic, malleable, and crucially, materially embedded in a physical landscape. Any community speaks to both insiders and outsiders. So on the one hand, we have the local social memories that hold recollections and stories about specific funerals, concerning perhaps the resting places of weapons, jewels, and the physical location of a burial in a cemetery, such as underneath a barrow or within these Roman earthworks. These repeated iterations, these burials, these modifications of funeral rites as they go down the ages, the nuances of which would only be known to the local group, tell us something about how that group is choosing to manifest itself in an enduring physical ritual space. But they're also telling us how that group spoke to itself about kinship and other inter and intra-household networks within the community. This internal conversation is clearly nuanced and about a lot more than just biological connections. On the other hand, the deliberate placement of cemeteries at particular locations, in these cases along routeways, provides insight into how a community manifested its permanent presence to the wider world. Careful alignments with prehistoric and Roman monuments and trackways being key to the first view for any outside visitor, as well as a daily reminder to locals of those past generations. So a trip to the local spring and back at Hatherdene, an expedition out to the fens and back from Ely, or a short trek to and from cultivated fields at Eye, were all much more than just that. These were daily reminders of rootedness in a landscape, evocations of past relationships, and a particularly complex and malleable symbol of the community itself.
Up until relatively recently, most of our information about early medieval Cumbria has come from the collections of stone sculpture and a handful of antiquarian finds of isolated Viking burials. More recently, archaeological works have begun to add to this picture, and particularly over the last 8 years, Oxford Archaeology North has published 3 significant sites from Cumbria, which have added substantially to the corpus of information about this fascinating area in the early Middle Ages. Cumwhitton, published in 2014, Workington, published in 2019, and Dacre in 2022. I will give you a brief overview of each of these sites in chronological order to shed some light on how they have informed our understanding of the development of burial practices and how they fit into the wider picture of early medieval Cumbria. Dacre is one of those rare sites that has a documentary reference associated with it. In his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, completed circa 731, the Venerable Bede writes of a miracle taking place in a monastery beside the river at Dacre, when one Thridred was the abbot. Whilst Bede does not tell us where this site was, there are only 2 so named in what was Northumbria, and Dacre near Penrith has early medieval evidence associated with it. The fragment of high-quality inhabited vine scroll pictured in the lower left is an indicator of the status of the site. Work was undertaken at Dacre between 1982-5 in and around the modern churchyard. To the north of the existing church, a cemetery of more than 234 graves was excavated. The acidic sandy soil in many parts of Cumbria meant the preservation of human bone was almost non-existent, except the enamel shells of some teeth. This meant that no C14 dating, stable isotope or DNA analysis was possible. However, the 11th-12th century churchyard boundary cut through the cemetery and left the majority of burials beyond it, giving a terminus ante quem for them. All the graves were remarkably accurately oriented, slightly off true east-west, and arranged in relatively regular rows, suggesting some degree of contemporaneity and continuity of burial here. There is an apparent focus of the cemetery towards the south, around what is now the chancel of the medieval church, and it's perhaps noteworthy that an early cemetery also clustered around the east church, now the chancel at Jarrow. In addition, all the grave cuts were of an adult size, and the position of the teeth suggested they had been laid supine in the graves. Few grave goods were associated with the cemetery. 14 of the graves preserved in situ iron fittings, including hinges, locks, and brackets, and there was a wealth of additional examples from the surrounding layers. These fittings were from the wooden boxes or coffins the dead were buried in, and are best paralleled by 19 other sites, 17 of which are from the north, within the ancient kingdom of Northumbria. These include sites such as St Michael's Church in Workington, Monk Wearmouth in Tyne and Wear, Ailsie Hill near Ripon, and Cheesecake Hill and Thwing in East Yorkshire, which date from the later part of the 7th to the 9th century. Elizabeth Craig Atkins has argued that this is a rite indicative of high-status burial within the Kingdom of Northumbria. A relatively rare type of bead for Britain was also found within one of the graves. There is an example from Cheesecake Hill, and similar beads are also found in Kent, but they are most often associated with 7th century Merovingian graves. It appears to have been damaged and ground smooth on one side to repair it, cutting through the glass surface to reveal the core construction beneath. 3 structures were found around the cemetery, 2 of which were rectangular post-hole buildings. Structure Y had a curved eastern end and the remains of a hearth inside, later rebuilt using an old millstone. A large volume of the early medieval finds, particularly window glass and metalwork, was found associated with this structure. Indeed, the site as a whole had an excellent collection of finds from the 8th and 9th centuries, such as these 9th century stikers, this strip or safety pin brooch, this unusual strap end, and no, it isn't a strap distributor, and this copper alloy stylus, important evidence for literacy. There were also some lovely examples of window and vessel glass, as well as this fragment of twisted rod, which is good evidence for glassworking. Traces of several ditches were found around the excavations. In the west there appeared to be a clear delineation of the edge of the identified cemetery. To the east, these were less intact, but presumably formed similar external and internal boundaries. There was also evidence for a wider boundary ditch running in a large curving loop to the south around the site, which might have enclosed the site or defined the southern edge of it. In 1985, a large drain in the south of the churchyard, which had been excavated in the 1920s, was re-excavated. It was lined by well-dressed blocks that appear to have been Roman in origin, perhaps from the nearby fort at Brewham or a bridge or mill. 2 channels came together from the north, implying it was draining 2 adjacent structures. It's tempting to think that this may have been something akin to the 2 buildings to the south of the church at Jarrow. There's no evidence for when the cemetery fell out of use, except for the 11th-12th century churchyard boundary cutting right through it, but the Dacre stone, with its crude carving but sophisticated iconography, dating to the 10th century, after the traditional decay of Northumbrian monasticism, speaks to the continued use of the site as a place of some importance. In September 1994, the standing post-medieval church of St Michael's in Workington, on the footprint of its medieval predecessor, was badly damaged by fire, reducing the interior to a shell and leaving only the tower intact. The church is situated on a low tongue of land pointing towards the Irish Sea, on the south side of the River Derwent at its mouth. The church has long held a collection of stone sculpture, which had indicated that it had early medieval origins. Having remained unpublished for many years, in 2012 Oxford Archaeology North was commissioned to undertake the analysis and publication of the site. The stratigraphically earliest feature was an enigmatic ditch just over 1 metre wide and 0.7 metres deep, shown here as a red line. It contained no dating evidence, but the earliest burials were cut into its fill, though just how much older it was than the burials is uncertain. Perhaps the most intriguing thing about this is that it seems to have defined the end of the promontory. When we look at the distribution pattern from the earliest phase of burial, this distinction becomes even more pronounced. Unusually for Cumbria, skeletal remains were preserved, although in the early cemetery they were often in poor condition, but this at least allowed some analysis. In total, 29 graves containing 40 individuals were identified as early, all but 2 located to the southeast of the ditch, or within its fill. The majority were also placed in alignment with the ditch, northeast to southwest, with the head to the southwest. Whatever this boundary represented when it was first created, it was still being respected. Indeed, burial 202, with a tight radiocarbon date range of Cal AD 605 to 670, was placed directly in the upper fills, providing a terminus antiquem for the creation of the ditch. One group of intercutting graves showed the density of burial in some parts of the site. The earliest of these, 174, had a radiocarbon date range of Cal AD 670 to 770. It contained 2 iron hinges from some form of wooden box or coffin the individual was buried in, similar to those at Dacre. Iron fittings from 2 other possible boxes or coffins also came from at least 2 other graves within the cemetery. This grave was cut by at least 2 others, 167 and 204, which in turn were cut by grave 166, the uppermost burial in the group. Grave 166 was dated to Cal AD 770 to 905, hinting at continuation of burial practices and alignment with the ditch for a reasonable length of time. The dating from this phase more broadly suggests a start in the 7th century, continuing into the 9th. 37 of the 40 individuals were adults, 2 adolescents and 1 young child. Determinations of sex were possible for 18 individuals. 12 were estimated to have been female and 6 male. Isotope analysis suggested that the individuals were of Western British origin, consistent with values for West Cumbria. With such a small sample, it's prudent not to read too much into the data, but the concentration of adults particularly may be worth noting. When we consider the nature of the site at this period, these 2 pieces of sculpture are particularly interesting. The first is a fragment of cross shaft, and the second a building stone with a personal name on it, reading OSI and then some less decipherable letters, which has been suggested to read Osithgid. These have both been dated to the 8th to 9th centuries, and the building stone is best paralleled at Jarrow, where another such stone with a name was found. This may indicate, in conjunction with the prevalence of adult burials, that we have a similar ecclesiastical site here, perhaps a monastic foundation for both monks and nuns. The Historia de Sancto Cuthberto records that the wandering community of St Cuthbert tried to embark for Ireland from Derwentmuth in the late 9th century, but the saint had other ideas and raised a great storm from his coffin. Now Workington is at the mouth of the Derwent, and regardless of the veracity of the other elements of this particular source, the history does generally refer to known ecclesiastical sites as being places the saint's corpse visited, perhaps adding to this interpretation of the site. There is one very interesting burial, a probable adult female from the southern part of the site, which contained an unusually large number of small finds for a Christian cemetery of this period. The radiocarbon date range was Cal AD 690 to 885, but a strap end with crude Borer-style ring chain decoration suggests the burial is most likely towards the end of that range. As well as this strap end, it also contained a buckle, a sickle, a knife, and a whetstone. Sadly, the grave had been heavily disturbed by later burials, meaning the exact position and relationships of some of the objects could not be determined. This grave was not, however, unique in containing dress items and items of jewellery. Other burials contained occasional such finds, including this belt of northwest insular style and a finger ring. This is also a practice seen at burials at Carlisle Cathedral, where items of personal dress were also found within burials. The 10th century at the site is something of a mystery. While some elements of stone sculpture, such as this circle-headed cross and these fragments of hogback with interesting outward-facing heads, have been dated stylistically to this time, there is no evidence for an associated phase of burial. Now, I've not finished with Workington yet, but I am going to pause the site narrative here in the interests of a chronological progression. The site at Cumwhitton was discovered in 2004, when a metal detectorist, Peter Adams, discovered a pair of oval brooches in a field adjacent to the village of Cumwhitton, a few miles southeast of Carlisle. Such brooches are usually found within higher status burials of Scandinavian women, and are rare within Britain, particularly in England. After an initial evaluation phase, the site was fully excavated by Oxford Archaeology North, uncovering evidence for an early 10th century inhumation cemetery of fully furnished graves. 6 graves were identified on a northwest to southeast alignment. The one containing the 2 oval brooches was towards the summit of the low hill to the southwest, separated from the others by some 12 metres. The remaining 5 graves seem to have been arranged in 2 rows on a similar east-west alignment to the first. The central grave of a row of 3 was within a semicircular ditch, suggesting it may have originally had a low mound over the top of it. The second row to the west of this was on the same alignment, but the uncomfortable spacing of the rows suggests that these were not absolutely contemporary. As often in Cumbria, the only skeletal material was a small piece of skull from grave 1, which had deteriorated to such an extent that insufficient collagen remained for scientific analysis. Importantly, the fact that all the graves were furnished, as is frequently seen within Scandinavian burial rites of the 9th and 10th centuries, gives us some clues as to the individuals interred and the community that buried them. Grave 1, where the oval brooches originated from, has strong affinities with female graves in Scandinavia and parts of northwest Britain and Ireland. The paired oval brooches preserve mineralized textiles of the shoulder straps of a style of tubular dress worn by Viking women. A silver-bound knife and a key were suspended from one brooch by a cord, and the key fitted the lock from the remains of an iron-bound chest found at the feet. The chest contained shears, a glass slick stone or linen smoother, the remains of an antler comb, and a lead spindle whorl, as well as traces of many different fabrics piled in and around the chest. Fragments of another earlier oval brooch were found in the plough soil, though there was no clear indication of which grave they came from. 4 of the other graves contained weapons, which are very rarely found together with such brooches, so it seems likely that this brooch may have come from the 5th grave, grave 2. This contained the remains of an oil shale finger ring, an armband of very small diameter, a belt buckle and strap end, and a nested group containing a drinking horn with tinned copper alloy mounts, a sickle, shears, and an antler comb, as well as 8 green and yellow glass beads. The volume of jewellery and beads, together with the similarities of the nested group of comb and shears to that in grave 1, and the lack of martial gear compared to the other 4 graves, suggest that this may have been that of another woman, although of course without skeletal material this must remain speculation. The remaining 4 graves all contained a remarkable selection of objects: swords, spearheads, folding blades, ringed pins, and belt fittings. Many of these, particularly the latter 2, seemingly of local manufacture. In many instances, objects apparently missing within some graves could be explained by material found in the plough soil. Grave 3, for example, had no spearhead within it, but at least 2 spearheads were found in the plough soil, and grave 6 seemed to be missing a sword and a ringed pin, but again both of which were present within the plough soil material. The notable differences seem to be grave 4, which had a shield boss and an axe within it, providing perhaps a more martial character to this burial. Grave 5 was the largest of all the burials, and in addition to the spears, swords, buckles, pins, and knives from the other graves, it also contained a large hook and chain, probably for suspending a cauldron over the fire, a decorated drinking horn, and sacks, with a horn handle inlaid with decorative patterns made from silver wires, the latter 2 particularly most likely of local workmanship. Given the probable mound above it, this grave clearly denotes a person of some importance within the group. The remains of mineralized organic material preserved on the outside of the metal finds gave us a glimpse of horn handles, wood, and leather, including traces of sealskin, and also the textiles of the interred individual's clothing, which were spun and woven in a manner found in Britain, suggesting they may have acquired their garments locally. Although we can't say much about the origins or lives of these individuals, we can see that their families and friends buried them in this small cemetery following a Scandinavian tradition, perhaps suggesting they were a family or kin group, with objects from Scandinavia, but others like the buckles, sayaks, horn mounts, spurs, and textiles suggest some degree of acculturation. These burials also need to be seen in the context of antiquarian finds from Cumbria, such as the burials from Heskett, Espatria, and Ormside, sites largely uncovered in the 18th and 19th centuries, containing well-dated grave goods from the early 10th century. There are indications of other burials at Eaglesfield with a sword, and a bent sword found at West Seaton, suggesting that there may have been more numerous originally. Interestingly, West Seaton is just over a mile north of Workington, where I will now return to. Perhaps the introduction of Scandinavian settlers into Cumbria in the late 9th and early 10th centuries created a degree of social or political instability, and this may explain the apparent hiatus of burials at Workington. Perhaps burial 196 here relates to this transition in some way. However, we must not reject the notion that the earlier period of burial simply carried on but lessened in intensity, or perhaps the dead were simply buried elsewhere. What we can say is that a second phase of burial was a clear departure from the earlier cemetery in every way. The radiocarbon dates suggest a remarkably short second period of burial, perhaps as little as 40 years in the first half of the 11th century. There were 18 burials from 16 graves associated with this phase, all of which were aligned true east-west. The old association and alignment with the ditch was gone. Of the 18 individuals, skeletal remains suggested 12 were adults and 5 were children, including 2 infants. 6 of the adults were thought to be male and 4 female, and stable isotope work suggested that, as in the earlier cemetery, all the individuals were from Western Britain, with values consistent with the local area. All but 2 burials were closely grouped together around the area which was to become the south door of the medieval church. 141 was placed centrally within the footprint of the medieval church and was cut by a later medieval pit for the font. Despite there being no physical remains of a 10th or 11th century church, this suggests that there may well have been such a structure on a similar plan as the 12th century stone one, which these burials were arranged around. As well as the orientation and arrangement of the cemetery, the character of the burials themselves was dramatically different. 10 of the 16 graves used sandstone slabs to create kists, most of which were plain dressed stone, but 2 examples contained stones with crude geometric motifs. 2 of the kists also preserved traces of a sandstone capping, and 1 also had a stone base. In one of 2 double burials, the uppermost burial, 256, was estimated to be a 36 to 45-year-old male who had their head resting over a neonate. The second double burial appeared to contain 2 adult men placed on top of one another, 300 and 303. The uppermost burial, 300, was quite intriguing, as the individual had evidence of 3 healed fractures on his ulna, including 1 parry-style fracture typically sustained when raising an arm to ward off a blow. The individual also sustained several instances of peri-mortem sharp force trauma to the upper chest around the clavicle and manubrium. These cuts seem to have penetrated deeply into the body, causing cuts to the 3rd and 4th thoracic vertebra. This many cuts in such close proximity are unlikely to have been the result of free combat, and were probably caused by a sharp implement like a knife or spear when the individual was already incapacitated or dead. Lauren, one of the osteologists, has recently posited that the defects to the manubrium are consistent with a median sternotomy, where cuts are made to open the chest to remove organs. These injuries may be the result of a fatal stabbing of an individual who was already incapacitated, either asleep, unconscious, or held down, although post-mortem ablation of the heart was a common practice in high-status burials in medieval Europe from the 11th century onwards, so this may be an alternate explanation. A much larger number of sculptural fragments from this period have been found at St Michael's. Some were very fine, but others less so. Of particular interest is a fragment of broken grave slab with 2 decorated faces. If these are overlaid on the cross shaft from Great Clifton just 3 miles away, the similarities are striking. The red-shaded fragment here matches the Great Clifton piece perfectly, suggesting the use of some form of detailed template. It also contains motifs that have been linked to both pagan and Christian belief, showing the blending of belief and art styles that was taking place in the north. These 3 sites are seminal in understanding the emerging pattern of burial in Cumbria, particularly when the wider context of sculpture, place names, and other evidence is considered. At places like Dacre and Workington, we have evidence for burial at ecclesiastical sites, with small volumes of good quality sculpture. This is reflected more widely in the county by early sculpture from the 8th and 9th century concentrated around Carlisle, the Eden Valley, and the west coast. In the early 10th century, there are several furnished burials like those at Cumwhitton, containing jewellery, swords, spearheads, axes, and other objects, synonymous with the burial traditions of Scandinavia at the time, the Vikings of popular history, who seem to have settled the Solway coast and Eden Valley, where there is also strong place name evidence. In the later 10th and 11th centuries, considerably more sculpture was produced, in the art style of the time, heavily influenced by Scandinavian art and mythology, but also of varying quality, with an expansion of sites particularly down the west coast and Eden Valley. The Dacre stone is a good example of newer and often cruder sculpture, though the iconography is still extremely sophisticated. But this is even more evident at sites like Workington. One must ask, are the people at Workington the long-looked-for second or third generation of Viking settlers? Their isotopes suggest people brought up in the area, but then, isn't that what we would expect? The burial traditions seem to be incorporating local traditions, but then, isn't that also what we've come to expect from such burials? Indeed, the Cumwhitton finds contained as many artefacts as local style and manufacture as they did Scandinavian. Could this be just evidence of the adoption of new traditions and art styles by existing inhabitants? Either way, the new group of prominent kist burials at Workington seems to be respecting an as yet unidentified church, and may well have been of wealthy patrons who invested in and commissioned the new sculpture at the site. And these stone-lined burials right outside the church were presumably in respect of this relationship. This and the evidence from many ecclesiastical sites in the northwest suggests a move towards a new focus for sites like Workington and Dacre as parish churches, which serve their lay community. The only documentary source we have for the area is Gospatric's Writ, believed to be an 11th century document granting permissions and rights in Allerdale. The people named within it had names of English, Gaelic, Brythonic and Scandinavian mixed origin, reflecting the diverse makeup of the area, seen also in material culture and place names. The importance of these new parish churches as a focus for community and burial continued into the later medieval period and beyond, and both St Michael's at Workington and St Andrew's at Dacre remain churches serving their communities to this day.
Thank Stu, Toby and Adam hugely for such stimulating conversations and talks, and I hope they've given us a lot to think about and talk about in the next hour. Just before we throw it open, I would like to remind you that the Q&A function is available for you to put your questions, and I will do my best to put them in the right direction to the panelists. And also, if you want to, there is the chat function. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Emma Brownlee from Cambridge University, who we're delighted to say has been added to the panel. I'd now like to ask our chairman of the panel, or chairperson, should I say, of the panel, Professor Helena Hamerow, to start the ball rolling in the discussion section.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Obviously, thank you to our three speakers. Those were excellent papers, and I think, you know, we're incredibly lucky to get these sneak previews into sites that are, you know, undoubtedly of national importance. So, you know, it's really exciting to see this material, some of which has only really very recently been excavated, as Toby was saying. So I think the way to proceed is we're going to give priority, I think, to the questions that are coming in. And I think there might be one or two, Rachel, that have already come in and that you might want to kick off with. But then once we've answered those, I think I'd like to throw it open to the panel. I think if panel members want to come in to answer questions as well, some of them are specific and directed to particular sites or speakers, but I think, you know, others a little bit more general. So we can throw it open. Slightly tricky to do this online and keep it flowing. So I think tedious as it is, I think probably best for panelists, if you want to come in, to just use the little raised hand function. Is that okay? Can we see how that goes? Thank you. Good. Okay, Rachel, I think there are some questions. Is that right?
Absolutely. There are 3 questions so far, of which 2 really are pointed at Stu and Toby, because they both relate to stable isotopes and indeed genetic evidence. Firstly, from Rebecca Silwood, has any isotopic analysis been undertaken on the multiple occupancy graves to see if there was any familial relationships between the burials? And secondly, from Fraser Brown at OA North, is there any genetic evidence from the Cambridgeshire cemeteries informing on kin relationships?
I guess I'll start that, but I'll probably hand it over to Duncan and Toby to some extent. No, we haven't got any isotopic analysis yet, but Duncan has led on sampling for DNA. And that's from a range of both sort of higher and lower status, well, in terms of grave goods, burials, and multiple and single burials. I think there is one kind of a second degree relationship, but actually considering that we sampled a lot of those multiple graves, we didn't actually get direct relationships, did we, Duncan?
No, we didn't, which is really interesting. There was none of the multiple graves that we sampled from Hatherdene showed any similarity whatsoever in those regards. But at the moment, the tests that were done will look at first, second, and third degree relationships. So you can't look at slightly more distant ones. So if people are sort of second or third cousins, or cousins once removed, it would be more difficult to see that sort of relationship. And hopefully, we'll be able to do that at a later point to look in more detail at that sort of thing. What we did find at those sites is a pattern, both in the DNA, where you can see a greater degree of similarity amongst male burials than you can again amongst female burials, and that's also true of the teeth analysis that my PhD student Alison Stuart did, where she saw much greater diversity. Just going to go see his sister. A greater degree of diversity amongst the women. So it does suggest that we are looking at some sort of patrolocality at those sites, and that might be why you've got a little bit of distance. But Ely, there was very interesting kinship relationships, and the Ely Cemetery had a sort of chronological variation where those burials in the north of the road section, 3 of them were related to each other by the second or third degree. And then one of those individuals was related to one of the individuals to the south of the cemetery slightly later. And what's interesting is that those 3 at the top in the north were related by Y chromosome, so through a male line. And that difference in the chronology was through the female line, through the X chromosome, or through the mitochondrial DNA. So we can sort of start to see slightly different patterns in that as well, which is quite good fun.
I've also got an ancillary question that's related to that, particularly aimed at Stu. Sorry, Stu. That do we know the ratio of male, female, and child burials from the site? This is from Jess Elleray up here in the OA North.
Now you're asking. I will confess that in that talk, I've hugely neglected all of the osteological evidence and limited environmental evidence. So I would have to go and look that up, I'm afraid, or wait for the hopefully imminent publication.
Okay, thanks very much.
Sorry.
That's all right. I also have one for Adam from Lorna Carter. Could the later changes at Workington reflect the extension of Strathclyde into what is now Cumbria on the basis of similar carving styles?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. We've been very fortunate actually up here. We've had a number of people looking at the region from a historical point of view, both one of our panelists, Professor Claire Downham now, and Dr. Fiona Edmonds as well, who's done a lot of work on Strathclyde and Cumberland and how that all interacts with northwest England. And some of the more recent theories have suggested that actually the kingdom of Strathclyde, based around, the Clyde in Glasgow, expands its territory southwards after the sack of Dumbarton, and may well start to include large parts of northern Cumbria, which could explain the propensity of Scandinavian burials on the northern strip down the coast. So if you're like, it's a bit like the old poacher come gamekeeper sort of scenario where, you invite Scandinavians into, settle some of these lands, which may explain why some of the places are actually amongst the largest settlements like Carlisle and stuff. There seems to be no interference there. So it may be sort of a not quite as an aggressive takeover as we previously thought. I mean, there's still obviously a lot of work going on with things like that, but it is one theory, particularly given how similar some of the material is and some of the iconography on it. For example, we have a sword pommel with some key pattern motifs on it from Cumwhitton, from grave number 3, which are very similar to sorts of art styles that are used in the Irish Sea region generally. So we are seeing a degree of acculturation, but of course, our biggest problem with stuff like that is we've got, you know, for a start, we've got no bodies to do any work to understand that in a bit more detail. And number two, even if we did have bodies, unfortunately, it doesn't really tell us where they were from and what their story was, which is perhaps the most frustrating thing. But I certainly think the relationship with Strathclyde's an interesting one. And as I mentioned at the end of the talk, the Gospatric's writ does, I think it starts with a line that says, in the lands that were Cumbrian, or that were Combres, which suggests that by the 11th century, they weren't anymore. They were perhaps Northumbrian again, but previously they had been Cumbrian, which would be the period where all these Scandinavian burials are going in. I don't know if Claire's got anything to add to that.
No, not really. I would concur with what you said there, Adam. As you say, it's really difficult to know. I think, for example, as a historian, we're always looking for evidence of political links, but the use of art styles, we don't know if people thought that was a conscious political statement. And again, I'm really interested in looking at some of the zigzag patterns on the kiss graves that you showed on that slide are very reminiscent of, say, the type of sculpture you see south of Dublin with the Rathdown slabs. So I'm also very interested in Irish history, so I'm interested in the links that way rather than the north and the south. So I think it would be, there's definitely more research, I think, to be done in sort of mapping out, if you like, the vocabulary of these patterns, and also to really question, what does this mean? Is this a conscious statement of political affiliation? Is it just that this is fashionable? Does it reflect kind of trade links and that these are sort of desirable styles because they reflect prestige and therefore they're being reproduced in sculpture? And that to me is the real challenge, is decoding what people really meant when they were using these designs. So yeah, intriguing. And I think definitely there is more work to be done. And I think, with the Strathclyde sculpture, we need to explore, we can identify various influences in that from Pictish designs, for example, on the leg scrolls, and we can talk about influences from Ireland, but what exactly is a Cumbric artistic repertoire? There is more work to be done, and it is interesting, Adam's work in particular, in noting some of the stylistic similarities that we're finding in grave goods, say, at Cumwhitton compared to other sites in Cumbria. So a lot of more to be teased out, I think, generally on this subject.
Thank you. By the magic of electronics, Stu has managed to find a bit of information to answer the previous question, as indeed has Liz Popescu, if you need any support in that, Stu.
Yes, I may well do. I don't know what Liz was going to add. I was just going to add that I don't know if it's worth me sharing the slide that we. I haven't got the full demographic breakdown, but we do have sort of two areas of kind of infant burials clustered, which I didn't highlight during the talk. Here we go, share screen. This one. Right, is that coming through?
Yes, thank you. That's fine.
So yeah, we've got the old Roman trackway here, and all of these, I mean, they're visibly just about visibly smaller. These are all infant or child graves clustered around here. So I don't know if my mouse is showing actually, but around the western barrow and within the trackway, and then also just sort of to the southwest of the building, between the structure and the cremation enclosure, there's another cluster of infant burials, or there's one or two where the graves are practically empty, but we do have a couple of grave goods. I think a single bead and a piece of lead wire. So yeah, it's just to highlight that there is that kind of definition there, and that it's sort of those were being placed together. I think other spatial kind of patterns are harder to discern, but Toby might be able to speak to that more, and I'll, I don't know if Liz has anything particular to add to that.
Liz has come back with the statistics in effect. She says the adult assemblage comprised 36 males, 20 definite, 9 probable and 7 possible, 26 females, 3 definite, 12 probable, and 11 possible, and 2 individuals of indeterminate sex. So,
well, yeah. Thanks, Liz, for supplying with that.
I have one more question, which is to all the speakers, from James Davison, who thanks you all for such interesting presentations. He asks whether the speakers have come across any graves from the cemeteries discussed where the anatomy or sex of the individual inhumed, as suggested by the osteology, where possible, doesn't correlate with the gender signalled by the assemblage accompanying them.
I think we might have a panelist or two with something to say on that subject as well.
Exactly.
Who would like to go first?
I can start with Hatherdene Close. The very quick answer is no. We had some individuals that were indeterminate according to their osteology, either because of their age or simply because of their bone structure. And in fact, in all cases where we had genetic testing on those individuals, it confirmed the gendering of those individuals by their grave goods, as we would expect at Hatherdene Close, at least.
Anyone else? Yes, Sam, please.
So not specific examples, but I think it's worth having a think about what a gendered assemblage actually is, because I do find that people make some assumptions about what makes a gendered assemblage without actually thinking it through properly. So there is clearly a very gendered assemblage in this period that involves the paired brooches, the sort of large assemblages of beads on the one hand, and associations of weapons on the other. But there are also burials that, for example, just have a single brooch or a small collection of beads. And I wouldn't put that as a female grave, because that's something that does seem to be associated with both sexes. So I think when you're talking about gendered assemblage, I think you need to be quite specific about how it's composed and what you mean by that. I think if we start to just say, you know, a brooch is a woman, that's where you get into some of the difficulty.
Thank you. We have Adam and then Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, we had the problem at Cumwhitton where we had no bodies. So unfortunately, we really realistically have no data whatsoever. So most of our assumptions were based purely on other burials in Scandinavia and what they are most likely to be. So for example, the paired oval brooches in Scandinavia are normally from osteologically sexed female burials. Weapons can be usually assigned to osteologically male burials, but there's been recent work by people like my friend Leszek Gardela, who's looked at burials with weapons within them that are osteologically sexed to females. Of course, has been fairly famously the burial from Dacre in Sweden. So it's something we have to be incredibly cautious about, and I'm sure everybody on the panel agrees with it, that when we use osteological data, it really is just tools. It's information that's shaded with a degree of certainty and purely about looking at it as raw data, not necessarily about who that person was in life, because that's the sort of thing we can't tell at all, basically. And from the other sites, one thing that's quite interesting, Workington, for example, we had the burial with quite a lot of goods in it, belts and things like that. Now, usually female burials from the 9th to 10th century in Scandinavia and places like that don't have belt fittings within them, metal belt fittings from leather belts. But yet we seem to be getting a bulk of evidence now from the north and western parts of Britain and Ireland that's suggesting that there are osteologically female burials with leather belts within them. So, I mean, famously, the Kneep burial has a quite elaborate belt fitting from the 9th, 10th centuries. One of the Cumwhitton ones seems to have a belt in it. One of the Workington ones has a belt in it now. There's a burial from the Isle of Man with the oval brooches that now has a belt in it. So we're actually starting to see an accumulation of evidence, and what we're not sure about is whether that's perhaps what is considered to be the norm in Scandinavia is becoming less the norm for these diasporic communities as they move abroad, and local customs perhaps creep into their repertoire of things that they either wear or bury the dead with, because those may be distinct things. So we might be seeing a mixture of some things that we would expect, and then some things that are changing as these communities move into different places.
Thank you, Adam. Then we have Duncan, and after Emma.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting. I love the idea that you might change how you're dressing when you cross the sea. I was going to add, actually, for the wider genetic project is really interesting, because we were able to compare Hatherdene with a whole range of different sites, including Dover, Buckland and West Heselton, where there have been famously a number of individuals who have had this different osteological assessment and gravegood assemblage, as the question alludes to. And what's been quite interesting about those graves is each time the genetic evidence has conformed to the biological sex that we would assume on the basis of gravegoods, which I have to say was quite disappointing when we found that out. I sort of mined the data and had a look through it. It was like, oh, okay, it's really, really interesting. But given the sort of complexity of the conversation that surrounds that sort of nuance of gender expression in death, I think it would be a great shame to lose quite a lot of that. And I really echo what Sam says about the sort of complexity of those types of burials. One of our graves from West Heselton does have a small boy with a single brooch. Now, it may not be that is a gender expression. It may be that is something to do with age. They were also someone who were isotopically non-local, so it may be something to do with identity related to migration, as we've just seen with that really interesting conversation about belt buckles. But it might also be to do with sort of much more complicated relationships around identity within that site. So we've got age and migration, and perhaps, well, as we've seen in early modern England and early modern Northern Europe, boys wearing dresses and that sort of stuff. Perhaps there isn't a fully functioning idea of gender assemblages in burial until much, much, much later. And that's very, in age rather than time. And that, in itself, to have two brooches or two weapons in your burial isn't necessarily a gender signifier anyway. It's something that may be much more akin to family relationships or chronological period. So what's very clear is that when you can map family histories onto some of these burials, is that sort of groups of similar generations are the ones which have large assemblages of gravegoods. So perhaps we have all been aware of, but not discussing in great detail, the significance of the sort of generation and the chronological context in the gravegood assemblages that we see in these early medieval assemblages. And that's something that Sam Lucy has articulated really well previously, where we see differences in the way that 5th century burials are performed, and the sort of the really big phase of furnished burials in the mid 6th century, particularly weapon burials, is really important. That's a generation of people who are being buried with weapons, and I think that's becoming much more evident.
Thank you, Duncan. And before I pass on to Emma, I just want to say how much more interesting cemetery studies are now than when I was a student. And I think this conversation demonstrates that. So please, over to Emma.
Yeah, I had a student this year who looked specifically at osteologically male burials that were buried with more feminine assemblages. And we focused particularly on St Anne's Hill in Eastbourne, where I think there's about 4 or 5 of these osteologically male burials with brooches and beads and girdle hangers. So the full suite of this feminine display, not just the odd 1 or 2 brooches. And I think she argued very convincingly for a queer theory, a queer reading of these sorts of burials. So they're definitely out there, and I'd like to see more attention paid to them, because I noted in the report for St Anne's Hill that they were noted on but not really discussed in any way at all. It was just, they are here, this is a bit odd, what do we do with this? But I don't think those ones were part of your DNA project, Duncan. So I would be very interested to get DNA back from that, and maybe we'd end up having to rewrite the whole thing.
Thank you. I mean, it's of course the case that, osteological sexing is not a perfect thing, and there's always an element of error, which raises questions always when you get these seemingly seeming mismatches and then raises all these interesting questions. Oh, just when I thought we might be out of questions, I think there
is one more.
There is one more.
Yes, from Kazia. Given the incidence of burial tampering at Hatherdene Close, is there any evidence for the reuse of brooches, inherited items, in other words, in later graves, being specifically taken to place with later burials of people who didn't have them, to dress them for the afterlife and onward journey rather than to wear in life? And I just putting a personal view in, that's one also, it might be worth picking up with Adam, where we have a brooch that is of the wrong date at Cumwhitton. So I don't know whether want to Hatherdene Close first. Yes.
Sure. Oh, sorry, Stu. Shall I go first?
Well, you can speak to the brooches themselves, but in terms of the evidence for them being taken, it's very hard to spot. You know, those disturbances of graves are not always. It's ambiguous as to why they've occurred. And you know, if you're missing a brooch or two brooches, how do you know? That's not necessarily the reason that the skull's disturbed. Yeah, so well, I guess Toby, yeah, you can speak to the actual types of the brooches and the dates that come out of that.
I think it would be really hard to tell if that were the case. What we definitely don't have are any sort of unpaired brooches where we have one pair in one grave and the other half in another grave that's been disturbed. But it would be really difficult to demonstrate that. So yeah, the short answer is no, not really. I think the other thing is that once the brooch had been buried, it depends for how long, it may not really be functional by the time you take it out again. But I think that's something that I was trying to talk about in my presentation in a slightly different way, that brooches are actually being exchanged between people during life, as opposed to after death.
Okay, thank you. Just wonder whether, since there's a brief lull in the questions, we might move the discussion on a little bit. So the three themes we have today are identity, kinship, and community. And I wonder if we could, well, if I could invite the panel especially, but speakers too, if they'd like, to talk a little bit about what you think the relationship was between the burial community and the living community. And I think, you know, we've got the best evidence for that really from the 5th to 7th century cemeteries. It's obviously it changes then as you get into the 8th century and beyond, because where we have the evidence, where there's been enough excavations, I think Toby said, we're getting almost every conceivable combination. So it used to be thought, well, one cemetery equals one community, one settlement. But now we're seeing seemingly one settlement with two cemeteries, two settlements of one cemetery, perhaps sharing, and everything else. And yes, I just wondered whether any of the panelists might want to come in and say something about what senses of community should we be thinking of here when we're comparing burial communities and living communities. Just to throw an idea out there. I mean, I just wondered good, Duncan, thank you. Come to the rescue.
Hi, Helena. I mean, that's really a question for you as much as anything else, as the sort of, as the writer on those settlements. But I always think that these things are not, we can't really think of a settlement as being in use for the whole length of time that the cemetery is in use. They seem to be a permanent fixture in a landscape that is otherwise shifting and moving around. And I did some sort of reassessment at a couple of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries to look at that sort of degree of mobility and movement that's taking place within the buildings, and there's a huge degree of shift and motion in that space. So what I think we're seeing in cemeteries is some degree of permanence. You get multiple generations of individuals being buried in the same sort of places, sometimes, as at Hatherdene, on top of each other, certainly creating these spaces within the cemetery, like at Hatherdene, where you've got this sort of reburial, really dense zoning in burials, lots of kids in particular spaces, and returning to those. But as those generations are shifting, so are the spaces where they're living in the landscapes. And really those timber frame buildings that we see don't seem to last for 2 or 3 generations. They seem to go up and come down again. And maybe, as I believe one of your students has pointed out, that actually the deconstruction of a household may be linked to the death processes, the death of the sort of household leaders, really. So I think we do need to sort of disavow ourselves from this Roman notion of solid fixed places in the landscape and really see them as very articulate and very mobile.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. Thank you, Duncan. I think Adam, you were next.
Yeah, I mean, for our sort of period up in the northwest, Workington's quite an interesting one in that you have the earlier cemetery that was very much aligned at a sort of 45-degree angle with the ditch, and then the burials are all within coffins with these iron fittings on, very much fitting within the tradition that's going on in Northumbria as large. The fact that it switches so dramatically to true east-west and buried in these lintel kist graves, it's one, I mean, as you were saying about this kind of way of sort of signalling to the community, or maybe the community themselves who are burying the people are signalling a change. What's quite interesting, there's been a lot of work on those sort of lintel graves done, particularly people like Adrian Maldonado, who wrote some really interesting stuff on burial traditions in the, because as Claire said earlier, we need to, in Cumbria, we need to look to Ireland, we need to look to Scotland, we need to look further afield, really. And those lintel graves, these kist graves, are really quite common in this north and western insular world. But usually it's a tradition that's dying out by the 10th and 11th century. So it's really interesting to see introduced in the early 11th century at Workington, almost as if there's some sort of, I don't know, reaffirmation of these ideas or a brief reprisal of them for 40 or 50 years before they then disappear again. Now there are stone coffins that start being used in the medieval period, but these lintel graves made out of little bits are quite a distinct, interesting thing. So I don't really have an answer, but I do think we do see similar things there where these ideas of how you bury people can change quite dramatically, quite suddenly, and against the general pattern in the area too. So there may have been some brief resurgence of an idea.
Yeah.
And the same, just tapping into the previous question about the older brooches and things too. We did have a burial at Cumwhitton that had there was a pair of oval brooches which belonged to the early 10th century. The majority of the grave goods belonged to that period too, sometime between 900 and 950. And yet one grave, or one brooch, we don't know which grave exactly it came from, actually dates to at least 100 years earlier than that, and it was quite badly damaged, heavily worn with holes in it. We also had some coins in one of the grave that were probably 50 to 100 years older, as well as Bronze Age flints being placed within the grave. So again, it sort of talks to both the previous question and this one in terms of there is a conversation going on here about the past and about how people are relating to the graves that they're burying at the present with them too. So
indeed, the whole question of the biographies of the objects that enter the grave, at what point do they exit the kind of world of the living, as it were, and do they enter the sort of mortuary world? Thank you. And Sam.
Sorry, I was just going to draw the panelists' attention. I don't know whether you've seen the chat from Jonathan Herald. Another consideration might be whether community change transformation can be detected over the course of a cemetery's life or use.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Sam.
So not an answer to your question about whether cemeteries belong to settlements and that way around, but I think there's a really interesting theme of when boundaries get used and when they're not. So we've got examples, I think Hatherdene Close, but someone also put up the mucking slide as well, where you've got a cemetery really quite physically bounded by former features, not contemporary ones, but former ones. And it's always struck me how interesting early medieval cemeteries and settlements are in their otherwise lack of boundedness. You know, the fact that you move from a Roman landscape where people are always sticking ditches around things into a 5th to 7th century landscape where they never do. And it's not until the 8th century that they start bounding things again. And you've also got this slightly interesting shift of you have burial in the 5th and 6th century away from where you live. And then in the 7th century, you start to put the dead back into where you're living. So I just think, there's no answers there at all, but there's some really interesting themes about when you enclose people and when you don't, and when you own them within your community and when you don't.
It is extraordinarily interesting. I completely agree. It's almost as if, if there are pre-existing boundaries there, we're going to respect them, take note of them, they're important, but don't expect us to dig any ourselves. It's just not something we do anymore. It is really interesting and puzzling. I think, Claire, you were next.
Yeah, I both wanted to ask a question out of sheer ignorance, and also sort of just commenting again on the textual sources, because obviously that's going to be my kind of thing. But just in terms of community and burial, I wanted to ask my archaeological colleagues really, how much work has been done from anthropology to sort of try and interpret how notions of community affect burial patterns? It's very difficult for us. Of course, we're always trying to imagine ourselves in the mindset of people so long ago and to see the choices that they might have made. And I guess to bring us out of our own perspective, it might be interesting to see what the evidence is from other cultures, not to say, oh, it will be like that, because I think that's quite a dangerous trend when we look at social anthropology and try and mirror things, but just to broaden our horizons of what could explain different patterns. So that's my question. I suppose my comment then really is, in terms of notions of community, it would be really interesting in drawing in legal and political sources. I mean, in terms of, a community being buried in a single location, what does that tell us about the sort of centralization of power? Is there an overarching authority trying to, if you like, coerce people to being buried in the same site, to make a statement about their authority? I'm also interested in terms of legal identities, so that the sort of net of who's legally responsible within a kin group, and does that legal identity then get represented in a burial context? Because that's a kind of institution within society that's quite decentralized but very significant in terms of one's responsibility to others, and is that reinforced in the burial environment? I'm kind of interested also going back into sort of James's question about identity in terms of the gendering thing. We do have textual sources on that. So we have, for example, early English penitentials that talk about basically prohibiting, if you like, relations between what it calls effeminate men, which suggests there was a category of people who were male but not conforming to male gender expectations. And you could maybe compare that with things like later Icelandic sources like Graugas, if we're trying to get a sense of Viking Age society, where, men's dress is determined to fit a stereotype. So if a man wears a shirt which is too low cut, that this is breaking a legal rule because that seemed to be effeminate. And that then raises another issue. If the laws are kind of criticizing this, they're trying to limit that. It shows it's happening, that people aren't conforming with gender expression, but it also shows a society which is not tolerant towards those variations. And I'm interested in how those patterns of toleration could have changed over time. I don't think it's consistent. I think we can see that in even in our own lifetimes, that the difference of attitudes within a social setting that might be towards people who diverge from norms, again, is that linked to kind of centralization of power. So I suppose I've just come up with lots of questions there, but I would plea for the significance of written sources, but I don't know if colleagues would comment on how other perspectives can be drawn in to try and broaden our horizons about ideas of community identity.
Thank you, Claire. It's extremely interesting questions, but we're now piling questions on top of questions. So is there anybody who would like to, and also, of course, you bring into our attention some really interesting written sources that are helpful. Would anybody like, I know Emma had her hand up, would anybody like first to come back to Claire with any just reaction really to her questions and observations? Duncan.
I'm happy to, basically because it's a great opportunity to plug my book, which does quite a lot of what you asked there, which is the early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. Well, I really look at this kinship stuff, without the DNA evidence, which we didn't have at the time. And I think that, to answer the first question there, have we used social anthropology? Yes, because archaeologists have been using social anthropology to inform conversations about social identity for a long time, really, since the mid-90s. Well, it was when I became aware of it, really, but much earlier than that in reality. So yeah, this sort of really complicated ways that people might change and look at their lives and how those evolve over generations is a very important part of how people have started to look at and talk about those things. In the book, what I do is compare loads and loads and loads and loads of cemeteries, and the thing that is most consistent is huge amounts of variation. We can see that at the difference between Ely and Hatherdene and the cemeteries in the north. They're chronologically disparate, but nonetheless very different to those sites. I excavated at Workington, which is not very far away from either of those two sites, and it looks completely different again. And really what you're seeing, I think, therefore, is a very extremely localized decision-making taking place within those spaces. So you can talk about legal authority. It's very difficult to talk about that in terms of archaeology because it's a legal category, it's a social category, which you can't excavate. But what you can see is that local identity is really very significant part in how those burial traditions are playing out in those sites over time. You can also see really neatly where those ideas are rejected and new burial forms start to take place, either within the site or when the site comes to an end. When Hatherdene has a very strict chronological basis and then it finishes. Whereas Ely, you've got this drift down the road over generations or centuries as it's moving along. So you've got two completely different ways of looking at and thinking about the evolution of the community and how it's telling those stories. I think Hatherdene is similar to Workington at a glance, where you've got a series of quite significant key burials in dense areas. So presumably then you're getting individuals being highlighted for a very short period of time before new identities, new generations start to take on that identity, both in male and female terms. So I think you can start to do it, but to do that, you have to have a really, really good idea at chronology. And what I think is really important about this is sites like Hatherdene are really a new generation of excavations where we're getting extremely good data on chronology. We're getting really good evidence from the survival, the excavation methods we're using are brilliant, and to be able to combine those things with radiocarbon dating strategies, DNA strategies, and isotope sampling strategies mean that we can really see the questions that are being asked by history and social anthropology and talk in a way that we just haven't been able to before.
Thank you, Duncan. No, that's very true. And I'll just throw a plea in there for more radiocarbon dating of unfurnished burials, because of course, when you do that with these early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, you sometimes get interesting surprises, as we've recently had for the cemetery of Fingalsham, famous cemetery of Fingalsham, long assumed to go out of use, probably early in the 7th century, and we have some 8th century unfurnished burials there. So we definitely have some more surprises to come. And I've slightly lost track of who's there. Now, Emma, you did have your hand up early on, but you've taken it down again. Is that deliberate?
Well, it didn't really follow on from what Claire was going to say. But I can go now. Yeah, I was just going to return to that point that Jonathan made in the chat about whether community change can be detected over the course of a cemetery's use. And I think I'd say that I guess it depends on what you mean by community change, because these are communities that are in flux constantly. There's people moving in and out of them. So it's not like we're looking for a sudden distinct change in who makes up the community. And like lots of the changes in burial practices that we see, like the decline in gravegrid use over the 6th and 7th centuries, probably can't be linked to community change. So for that one, I would actually say, no, we can't do that.
Thank you. And then we have, I think, Stu, Adam, and Toby in that order.
Yeah, I just thought I'd fill in a bit more background around Hatherdene Close, which does feed into that discussion of what is a community, or where is a community bounded, because we've got a reasonably good set of dates from the the 5th to the late 6th century, but we don't have any settlement evidence to go with that. That's not unusual necessarily, but there's been quite a lot of excavation done around that part of Cherry Hinton, and I think barring a few scraps of residual early Saxon pottery, there's nothing to go with it. And yet the evaluation that CAU are now proceeding to the excavation of that area, they had a 7th century radiocarbon date from a burial there. So just following on from our cemetery, possibly even overlapping, but within quite a short time period, that's 800 meters away. And to go with that, you've obviously got all the other cemeteries like Workington, very close by, more recent excavations in around Cambridge, and obviously Girton up the road as well. Just all these little pockets with sort of limited settlement to go with them. I suppose what I would also add to that is, so yeah, you've potentially got a continuation or a movement just 800 meters away into the next century. But I would also add that within the Hatherdene Close site, we just had the very border, the outer kind of boundary ditch of the Middle Saxon settlement, which is moderately well understood. We do have some boundaries and a few key excavations just to the east. And then that develops into the later Saxon, sort of early medieval cemetery. There's quite a large cemetery there that's been excavated, about 1,000 burials around a kind of a chapel structure. And I think something me and Toby talked about is that Middle Saxon stage of that settlement, it's within a couple of generations of when Hatherdene Close was being used. You expect there be some earthworks or some sort of folk memory of what was there. So to go into the 8th century, excuse me, it's quite interesting to think about what they thought or knew or remembered, or what their kind of traditions were about that area just to the east. I'm talking like 20 meters from their boundary, what that meant to them, going forwards in time. Those are just all sort of interesting questions to think about, I think. Toby would probably be able to elaborate on that.
Absolutely, on that. Actually, yes, I think Toby, you're next, aren't you? Is that right? I'm losing track.
I've lost track entirely, and I've now got about
maybe Toby and then Adam.
Got about 6 or 7 points lined up, responding to various different, but I'll just stick with one. I think that's exactly what we've tried to do at Hatherdene Close, is showing in the monograph, rather, is just written at great length about this in the forthcoming monograph about how that community is changing, because presumably we have a continuing community of some sort from the Roman period all the way through into the later medieval period in Cherry Hinton. The key changes in that community are when they start to reuse this Roman burial ground, and when they stop to use it and move elsewhere. But it all depends on your definition of scale here as well, because that's taking a sort of 200-300 year phases of changes of a community. I mean, I'm really glad that everyone's talking about community, because I failed to define it in any way at all in my presentation. So this is helping me to process some of those thoughts. But we really can see that within the cemetery itself as well, as different parts of that little landscape between this timber building and these Roman earthworks become more or less popular over time. So in the earliest phase, burial focuses around those Roman earthworks, and then it sort of drifts away. And then the later period, as we go into the early 7th century, attention returns to those Roman earthworks. So those it's not necessarily around burials, as Duncan was saying. I think actually in Hatherdene it's around landscape features, but also burials, if you see what I mean, because the burials are there. It accumulates. The site changes over time. So I sort of disagree that community is totally fluid and people come and go, because people do come and go. Practices change, the community changes, but they still use the same cemetery. So it's that is somehow defining that community, whatever that means. Wherever those people are actually living, being buried in the same place is somehow creating a community.
Can I just throw in there, I think something that's a really important point to make, because it emphasizes how when a community decides to abandon an ancestral burial ground and establish another one only a short distance away, it's an incredibly powerful statement. But it certainly, I think, is not a statement, we're no longer the same community, we're now a different group of people. But nevertheless, it is a very powerful statement to make, even more so if then later on, they return to do something interesting. There's a kind of afterlife for that earlier cemetery, which you do sometimes find. Okay, Adam, please, over to you.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say really about Workington, because that's pretty much what we have there. We do have evidence for this sort of 7th, 8th, 9th century cemetery doing some stuff. But then there is that gap in the 10th century. We don't seem to have any burials. So there's sort of 2 points there. Is that reflecting change in the community? Because that's when these Scandinavian inhumation burials are going in. So is that reflecting the change in the community going on in northern Cumbria? Or is it just site specific? Or, and the perennial cry of the archaeologists, more data, more data. You know, what if we excavated 100 yards to the west, to the south? Would we then find a zonation within that cemetery? Have they just changed where they're burying in the 10th century to then come back to bury on the same site in the 11th century? So there's continuity of the site, as you were talking about. They come back to the place and rebury there, albeit in a completely different fashion. But what does that gap actually reflect? Does it reflect genuine abandonment of the site, or does it reflect, you know, just some zonation within the site that we haven't detected because that's where it was excavated? And it's particularly bad, I think, in the you know, some of the sites we've got in the north, because we haven't necessarily excavated larger sections of the landscape to be able to look at the settlements associated with some of these, which is one benefit you have, particularly in the southeast with the, you know, 5th to 7th century cemeteries, is you're starting to look at these communities. I will say somewhere like Cumwhitton, the actual cemetery today is about 200 yards away from the modern village of Cumwhitton. And when you stand in Cumwhitton, it's on a low hill, just in eyesight of the village. And there is early medieval sculpture from the church in the village. So that there probably is these relationships there, but unfortunately, nobody wants to let us dig up a lovely picturesque little Cumbrian village for some unusual reason. So, but I mean, and just one final point for me is the localization is something that we do see too in Cumbria in the 9th and 10th century Scandinavian inhumation burials. So you have very similar suites of objects within the Heskett in the forest burial, which is 2 miles away from the Cumwhitton cemetery. Similar sword with similar silver inlay on the pommel in a local style, similar groups of goods, except that's a cremation burial and the sword had been bent. Whereas they're furnished inhumation burials with bodies seemingly supine from the little bit of bone we had. So a couple of miles away, dated basically the same period. Those people must have known or known of each other so close, and yet one's choosing cremation, one's choosing inhumation. So you're seeing similar groups of goods, similar artifacts, similar period, and yet different choices in the burial style. So yeah, odd stuff.
And I think Rachel, probably Adam just said what you were going to say. Is that right?
Absolutely. I was just going to mention Cumwhitton, where you have this very coherent cemetery and then nothing. And the only one you can interpret is, well, people took a conscious decision to bury elsewhere. And the obvious elsewhere is the early church that's a few hundred yards away. But we can't say that for certain because we don't have the evidence, but it's a reasonable sort of assumption. And one has to ask oneself, is that an artifact of conversion or something more complex?
Yeah. Duncan.
Thanks. Something Stu mentioned there, which I think speaks to this whole conversation to a degree, is this sort of afterlife of cemeteries. What happens and why? And I think we can see a little bit of that in the excavation evidence at Hatherdene. But we could at Workington, and it was really interesting. So we had one burial which had been disturbed by another burial accidentally. And what was really interesting about that is that this other burial was much bigger than it was expected to be, and it cut the feet off this young child. And the excavators had taken the feet and put them back into the grave again on top of their legs, which is fascinating. And when we come to the afterlife part of that, in the 8th century, there's a series of ditches that are cut right through the middle of Workington. And in the earliest one of the ditches, you can see the bones being put back into burials again. But by the time you get into the middle set of ditches, they don't care anymore. And we find bits of skulls and artifacts and things like that in the bottom of those ditches within the loose. There's clearly there is a point where there is a clear separation where this is no longer meaningful to them, where there's a point where you go, well, these were people and their bodies need to be preserved in some way or whole in some way, and they're recreating them to a point where they're just cutting ditches straight through the middle, destroying graves, and have no illusions to that whatsoever. So really, I sort of had a question for Stu, which was, when you've got this multiple intercutting graves with no body parts, is this a sort of, is this community change? Is this the obliteration of previous burials to place new identities onto those spaces, effectively transforming the identity of the cemetery? Or do you think that there's something much more going on between the relationships between the individuals in those burials, and how does that relate to sort of afterlife? What happens after the cemetery goes out of use?
I don't think we've got the chronological kind of resolution to really say that. I think I would just draw attention to the fact that we've got such a wide variety of ways that burials are interfered with. So there's the example I showed there that really looked quite careful, but damage had been done to the earlier burial. But they'd taken the time to put those bones back in, but also position the later burial in almost exactly the same kind of semi-crouched position, right next to each other. So that's obviously very careful, and you imagine that's kind of sticking to the same tradition rather than doing something completely different. But at the same time, you've got those other examples where they just didn't seem to care, and those bones, they're not in the backfill. They must have been charnel all over the place at times. And if a grave is completely cleaned out and somebody else put in there, you lose that earlier information completely. And I mean, particularly the chalk we were digging in, you couldn't see recuts. You could hardly see the cut edges. We were largely chasing, you might have a little bit of soil in the center of the grave, but you were largely chasing the skeletons to get to the edge of the grave. So yeah, it's just really hard to spot that kind of thing, I think.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there seems to be two different patterns, where you've got one where they're reopening old graves, presumably while bodies are still articulated, even potentially still fleshed, and putting new bodies in them. And it's very clear with your 2 or 3 on top of each other. And then you've got other ones where the partial destruction or total destruction of the body just quite reflects that. So there might be some considerable distance in some of those, where if you're cutting through a body, it's unlikely to have been completely fleshed at the point where you're doing that, because that would be pretty horrible.
And yet, but in order to do the particularly the rows are fairly, the graves they don't overlap except almost perfectly within a grave. So where they have done that and disturbed an individual, it seems less likely that it's by accident, or at least that they weren't expecting to find an earlier burial in there. But it seems that sometimes they didn't care, but it's not because they weren't expecting anybody. It's with the knowledge of what they were going to do.
That's very interesting.
We're now coming towards the end of our time slot for this seminar. I don't know whether anyone has any final thoughts, whether you want to sum up, Helena, or anyone else has things to say.
Apart from just thanking our panelists for a really, really stimulating chat. I could stay here all evening talking about this stuff. So thank you very much. And also thanks to the audience for some really, really good and stimulating questions. I think it's been a fantastic session, and also a real testament to the work that OA is doing in this area of early medieval cemeteries. So yes, Rachel, I don't know if you want to draw things to a close.
Yes, thank you very much, Helena. And may I echo your thanks to all the panelists for stimulating discussion, and particularly to our speakers for setting us on our way with such fascinating sites. Also, thank you to all the participants, as you've said, for stimulating questions. And it's particularly good to see a lot of international participants as well, which is very welcome. Just to say that if you've missed anything, or whether you want to hear anything again, both the presentations and indeed this discussion, which has been recorded, will go onto our YouTube channel in the next few days, once it's been tidied up and any bugs taken out of it. So you are very welcome to listen and watch again. Thank you very much for everyone for attending. This is one of a series of seminars that OA is running, and watch this space for the next one, which I think is moving inexorably towards a slightly more modern period. We started in the Mesolithic period and we've now got to the early medieval period, and I wait with interest to see what the next subject will be. So thank you all again.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.